The medical bay's sterile white walls reflected the harsh overhead lighting as Dr. Elena Vasquez approached examination table 7. The patient lying there was unlike anything she had encountered in her 15 years of xenobiology and trauma medicine. Commander Marcus Chen, formerly of the Terran Defense Coalition's 47th Strike Regiment, had been pulled from the wreckage of his escape pod 3 days ago. The burns covering 60% of his body told a story of survival that defied everything the Galactic Medical Council understood about pain tolerance and cellular regeneration. The Zephyrian medical staff had already classified him as a lost cause. Their chief physician, Dr. Kithara, had made it clear during the morning briefing that resources would be better allocated elsewhere. The human's injuries were too extensive, the cellular damage too profound. In their clinical assessment, Commander Chen represented a statistical impossibility, a being who should have died from shock and organ failure within hours of sustaining such trauma, yet continued to exhibit vital signs that, while weak, remained stubbornly present. Dr. Vasquez had requested the transfer specifically because of these anomalies. As the only human physician aboard the research station orbiting Kepler 442b, she felt a professional obligation to understand what was keeping her species representative alive when all conventional medical wisdom suggested otherwise. The burns weren't the worst she had seen in her career, but they were extensive enough that even with advanced regeneration technology, the prognosis remained grim. The patient's breathing was shallow but steady. Biomonitoring equipment displayed readings that fluctuated between concerning and miraculous. His heart rate maintained a rhythm that suggested someone in deep meditation rather than acute distress. Most puzzling of all, the neural activity scan showed patterns that the Zephyrian medical AI had flagged as unprecedented and requiring further investigation. Commander Chen's service record painted the picture of a soldier who had volunteered for increasingly dangerous assignments following the death of his family in the Centauri massacre. The psychological evaluations noted a man who had somehow transformed profound personal loss into unwavering tactical focus. His unit had earned commendations for operations that other regiments had deemed impossible, often involving infiltration of hostile territory where capture meant interrogation techniques that broke most beings within hours. The circumstances of his current injuries remained classified, but the preliminary reports suggested he had been captured during a deep reconnaissance mission in hegemony space. The burns weren't from weapons fire or spacecraft malfunction. They bore the distinctive patterns of systematic torture, methodical, calculated, designed to extract information through the careful application of suffering. Yet according to intelligence debriefs, no classified information had been compromised during his captivity. Dr. Vasquez activated her personal recording device and began her examination. The pattern of burns suggested the use of plasma-based torture implements, applied in sessions that would have lasted hours. The cellular damage indicated exposure to extreme heat that should have triggered immediate unconsciousness, yet the scarring patterns showed signs of healing that could only occur if the subject had remained conscious and cooperative with his own body's repair mechanisms throughout the process. She had read the preliminary interrogation reports. Commander Chen had maintained operational security despite endurance circumstances that had broken trained resistance specialists within the first hour. The hegemony interrogators had eventually abandoned their efforts, not because they lacked time or resources, but because their subject had demonstrated incapacity for enduring pain that fell outside their operational parameters. The medical readings became even more intriguing upon closer examination. Stress hormone levels remained elevated but stable, suggesting a physiological state that had adapted to extreme duress rather than succumbing to it. Neurochemical analysis revealed patterns typically associated with deep meditative states, as if the patient had learned to partition pain from consciousness while maintaining awareness and decision-making capabilities. Dr. Vasquez had specialized in comparative physiology throughout her career, focusing on how different species process trauma and stress. The Zephyrians, with their advanced nervous systems, experienced pain as an overwhelming sensory cascade that typically rendered them unconscious within minutes of significant injury. The crystalline Vorthan species processed physical damage as informational data, allowing them to maintain functionality but at the cost of emotional connection to their experiences. Humans occupied a unique position in this spectrum. Their pain responses were neither the overwhelming flood of the Zephyrians nor the cold calculation of the Vorthans. Instead, human neurology seemed capable of something that other species found incomprehensible: the ability to experience pain fully while simultaneously choosing how to respond to it. This capacity had been documented in historical records, but never under controlled medical observation. Commander Chen's case represented an extreme example of this phenomenon. The burn patterns on his torso formed a map of systematic torture that should have killed him through shock alone. Yet the healing responses showed signs of conscious cooperation with medical treatment even during unconsciousness. His body was repairing itself with unusual efficiency, as if his will to survive was somehow directing cellular regeneration at the molecular level. The implications were staggering. If humans possessed an innate ability to consciously direct their physiological responses to trauma, it would explain numerous historical accounts that other species had dismissed as exaggeration or mythology. The stories of human soldiers continuing to fight with injuries that would incapacitate other beings, of human civilians surviving disasters through sheer determination, of human explorers pushing beyond the physical limitations that define possibility for other species. Dr. Vasquez began documenting her observations with unprecedented detail. The medical community would need comprehensive data to understand what they were witnessing. Commander Chen's survival wasn't just a statistical anomaly, it represented evidence of capabilities that could revolutionize understanding of consciousness, pain management, and the relationship between mental state and physical recovery. As she worked, the patient's vital signs remained stable. His unconscious mind seemed to be engaged in active cooperation with her medical interventions, responding to treatment in ways that suggested awareness despite his comatose state. The neural activity patterns indicated someone who was not simply enduring his condition, but actively working to transcend it. The burn damage itself told a story that made Dr. Vasquez's hands shake with rage despite her professional detachment. The hegemony interrogators had been systematic in their approach, applying pain in calculated increments designed to maximize suffering while preventing unconsciousness or death. They had expertise in breaking the will of captured personnel, using techniques refined across centuries of interspecies conflict. Yet Commander Chen had endured. More than endured, he had somehow transformed the experience into something that strengthened rather than weakened his fundamental sense of self. The psychological profiles in his service record suggested someone who had spent years preparing for this possibility, not through resistance training alone, but through a deeper understanding of how consciousness could transcend physical circumstance. Part 2, The Awakening. 3 weeks after his initial examination, Commander Chen regained consciousness during Dr. Vasquez's morning rounds. The moment was unremarkable from a medical standpoint. Vital signs shifted gradually from sleep patterns to waking awareness, neural activity increased within normal parameters, and eye movement indicated returning consciousness. What was remarkable was the quality of that awakening. Most patients emerging from trauma-induced comas displayed disorientation, confusion, and immediate distress upon recognizing their condition. Commander Chen opened his eyes with the calm awareness of someone who had been consciously present throughout his unconscious state. His first words were not questions about his location or condition, but a quiet expression of gratitude for the medical care he had received. "Thank you for the skin grafts on my back," he said, his voice hoarse but clear. "I could feel them taking root. The cellular integration was more successful because you worked during the delta wave periods when my immune system was most receptive." Dr. Vasquez stared at him in disbelief. The skin grafts had been applied while he was in a medically induced coma, with no possibility of conscious awareness. Yet his description of the procedure was accurate down to the specific timing of immunosuppressive therapy administration. "Commander," she said carefully, "you've been unconscious for 3 weeks. How could you possibly know about the surgical procedures?" His response would become the subject of medical conferences for years to follow. "I wasn't unconscious, doctor. I was concentrated. There's a difference." Over the following days, as his physical condition improved with startling rapidity, Commander Chen began explaining concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, pain tolerance, and human potential. He described his captivity not as a period of victimization, but as an opportunity to test principles he had spent years developing through study of historical accounts, meditation practices, and deliberate exposure to controlled stress. The hegemony interrogators made a critical error, he explained during one of their sessions. They assumed that pain and suffering were the same phenomenon. They understood how to inflict pain, but they had no comprehension of how consciousness could separate itself from suffering while remaining fully present to the experience. Dr. Vasquez found herself documenting conversations that read more like philosophy than medical case notes. Commander Chen described techniques for maintaining awareness while allowing pain signals to pass through consciousness without creating resistance or attachment. He spoke of historical examples: human soldiers who had continued fighting with mortal wounds, civilians who had survived impossible odds through sheer determination, explorers who had pushed beyond physical limitations that other species considered absolute barriers. Every species in the galaxy has developed sophisticated methods for avoiding pain, he continued. The Zephyrians through unconsciousness, the Vorthons through emotional disconnection, the hegemony through the infliction of pain on others. Humans developed something different. We learned to experience pain completely while choosing how to respond to it. The medical implications were revolutionary. If Commander Chen's descriptions were accurate, humans possessed an innate capacity for conscious direction of physiological processes that other species achieved only through advanced technology. Pain tolerance wasn't a matter of enduring more sensation than other beings, but of fundamentally altering the relationship between consciousness and physical experience. Dr. Vasquez began conducting tests that pushed the boundaries of medical ethics. With Commander Chen's enthusiastic consent, she documented his ability to consciously direct healing processes, manage pain responses, and maintain cognitive function under stress conditions that would incapacitate other species. The results challenged everything the galactic medical community understood about the limitations of biological systems. The key insight, Commander Chen explained during one memorable session, is that pain is information, not instruction. It tells you what is happening to your body, but it doesn't dictate how your consciousness must respond to that information. The hegemony interrogators could control my physical experience, but they couldn't control what that experience meant to me. His descriptions of the torture sessions were clinical in their precision. He recounted each day of his captivity with the detached accuracy of a scientific observer, noting the techniques used, the physiological responses they triggered, and the mental strategies he had employed to maintain operational security. What emerged was a picture of someone who had transformed victimization into a form of active resistance. They were trying to break my will by overwhelming my capacity to process pain, he said. But will isn't located in pain tolerance. Will is the decision about who you choose to be regardless of circumstances. They could control my circumstances, but they couldn't control my choices. Dr. Vasquez began to understand that she was documenting more than medical anomaly. Commander Chen represented evidence of human capabilities that had implications for psychology, philosophy, and the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. His survival wasn't just a testament to physical resilience, but to a form of mental discipline that could consciously direct biological processes. The burn scars had healed with unprecedented efficiency. Tissue regeneration had proceeded at rates that should have required advanced medical intervention, yet had occurred through what appeared to be conscious cooperation with natural healing processes. Neural scans showed activity patterns that suggested someone who had learned to observe their own pain signals with the detachment of a scientist studying external phenomena. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, Commander Chen quoted during one of their final sessions before his medical clearance. It's not about becoming stronger than your circumstances. It's about recognizing that your circumstances don't define who you are. Dr. Vasquez realized she was witnessing the practical application of principles that most species considered purely theoretical. The relationship between consciousness and physical reality was more malleable than anyone had imagined. Humans had developed this capacity not through advanced technology or genetic modification, but through understanding something fundamental about the nature of awareness itself. Part 3, the revelation. The Medical Review Board's response to Dr. Vasquez's documentation was predictably skeptical. The Zephyrian Medical Council dismissed her findings as anthropocentric bias, arguing that her emotional investment in treating a member of her own species had compromised her scientific objectivity. The Vorthon representatives questioned whether humans were capable of the rational analysis required for accurate self-reporting of pain experiences. Even the human medical establishment expressed concern about the implications of her research. Dr. Vasquez had anticipated this resistance. Revolutionary findings always encountered institutional skepticism, particularly when they challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and physical limitation. She had prepared for the controversy by documenting everything with unprecedented thoroughness, creating a record that would allow other researchers to replicate and verify her observations. The breakthrough came when she was invited to present her findings at the Galactic Medical Conference on Proxima Centauri. The audience included representatives from every major species in the known galaxy, medical researchers who had spent their careers studying the boundaries of biological possibility. Dr. Vasquez knew that this presentation would either establish human pain tolerance as a recognized medical phenomenon or end her career in disgrace. She began with Commander Chen's medical data, presenting the physiological evidence without commentary or interpretation. The burn patterns, healing rates, neurochemical profiles, and consciousness indicators spoke for themselves. The audience grew increasingly restless as the implications became clear. What they were witnessing contradicted everything they understood about pain, healing, and the relationship between mind and body. The questions began immediately. Dr. Kithara, the Zephyrian chief physician who had initially dismissed Commander Chen as a lost cause, demanded to know how human consciousness could possibly direct cellular regeneration. The Vorthan medical representative argued that conscious pain tolerance was impossible without emotional disconnection, which their species had proven through millennia of research. Representatives from a dozen other species voiced similar skepticism. Dr. Vasquez had prepared for this moment by studying the philosophical and spiritual traditions of every species present. She understood that medical evidence alone wouldn't be sufficient to overcome centuries of assumptions about consciousness and physical reality. She needed to address the conceptual frameworks that made human capabilities seem impossible to other forms of awareness. The fundamental error, she began, is assuming that pain tolerance requires either unconsciousness or emotional disconnection. Humans developed a third option, conscious presence with experiences that other species find overwhelming. This isn't a matter of feeling less pain, but of changing the relationship between consciousness and pain. She presented Commander Chen's descriptions of his mental state during torture, comparing them to documented cases throughout human history. The pattern that emerged was consistent: humans who had transcended extreme circumstances through conscious choice rather than physical capability. The medical data supported these accounts, showing neurological patterns that indicated full awareness combined with conscious direction of stress responses. The audience's skepticism began shifting toward fascination as Dr. Vasquez presented her analysis of how different species had evolved to handle pain and trauma. Each approach reflected fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness itself. The Zephyrians had developed sophisticated mechanisms for avoiding painful experiences through loss of consciousness. The Vorthans had learned to process pain as abstract information while disconnecting from emotional response. Humans had taken a completely different path. Instead of avoiding pain or disconnecting from it, they had developed the capacity to experience it fully while maintaining conscious choice about how to respond to that experience. This approach required neither unconsciousness nor emotional detachment, but rather a deep understanding of the distinction between experience and identity. Pain tells you what is happening to your body, Dr. Vasquez explained, echoing Commander Chen's words. But it doesn't dictate who you are or how you must respond to what is happening. Humans learn to separate these two aspects of experience in a way that allows for conscious choice even under extreme duress. The implications extended far beyond medical science. If consciousness could consciously direct physiological responses to trauma, it suggested that awareness itself was more fundamental to biological processes than anyone had realized. The boundary between mind and body wasn't as fixed as conventional science assumed. Consciousness could actively participate in healing, adaptation, and survival in ways that bordered on the miraculous. Dr. Vasquez concluded her presentation with video testimony from Commander Chen himself. The scarred but clearly healthy former prisoner spoke directly to the assembled medical professionals, describing techniques that any conscious being could potentially develop. His calm demeanor and obvious physical recovery provided undeniable evidence that human pain tolerance wasn't mythology or exaggeration, but a documented medical phenomenon with practical applications. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, Commander Chen said in the recorded message. This isn't a uniquely human insight. Every conscious being has the capacity to recognize that their circumstances don't define their essential nature. Humans simply developed practical methods for applying this understanding during extreme physical stress. The conference hall fell silent as the implications settled in. If Commander Chen was correct, then consciousness itself was more powerful and adaptable than anyone had imagined. The techniques he described weren't supernatural or impossible, they were applications of principles that any species could potentially develop through understanding the relationship between awareness and physical experience. The questions that followed were different in tone from the initial skepticism. Medical researchers began asking about practical applications, about whether these techniques could be taught to other species, about how human pain tolerance could inform treatment protocols for trauma victims across the galaxy. What had begun as a presentation defending controversial findings had become a discussion of revolutionary possibilities. Dr. Vasquez realized that she had accomplished something more significant than documenting medical anomaly. Commander Chen's survival had opened a window into capabilities that every conscious being potentially possessed. The techniques he had used weren't dependent on human physiology, but on understanding something fundamental about the nature of awareness itself. In the months that followed, research stations throughout the galaxy began investigating consciousness-directed healing protocols. Medical schools added courses on the relationship between mental state and physical recovery. The case study of Commander Marcus Chen became required reading for trauma specialists across dozens of species. But, perhaps the most significant outcome was the gradual recognition that consciousness itself was the most important factor in determining how beings respond to extreme circumstances. Physical capability, advanced technology, and sophisticated medical intervention were all secondary to the fundamental choice about who one decides to be regardless of external conditions. Commander Chen had demonstrated that this choice remained available even under circumstances designed to make it impossible. His survival wasn't a testament to human superiority, but to a capacity that every conscious being possessed. The man who destroys his weak self, the part that believes circumstances define identity, can never be destroyed by others, because his essential nature exists independently of physical experience. Dr. Vasquez's documentation of his case became more than medical history. It became evidence that consciousness, properly understood and developed, represented the ultimate form of freedom. Not freedom from pain or difficulty, but freedom to choose one's response to pain and difficulty. This freedom, once recognized and cultivated, could transform any circumstance from victimization into opportunity for demonstrating what conscious choice could accomplish. The burned man who should have died had instead taught the galaxy something fundamental about life itself. Pain was temporary, circumstances were changeable, but consciousness, properly developed and understood, was indestructible. His scars had healed, but the lesson they taught would endure as long as conscious beings sought to understand the true nature of their own potential. In quiet moments during her research, Dr. Vasquez often returned to Commander Chen's central insight. The relationship between consciousness and physical reality was more malleable than anyone had imagined, but this malleability required understanding that consciousness itself was more fundamental than the experiences it observed. Those who grasped this distinction gained access to capabilities that seemed impossible to those who remained identified with their circumstances rather than their essential nature as aware beings. The man who destroys his weak self, the self that believes it is limited by physical experience, discovers that no external force can touch what he truly is. This wasn't philosophy or mysticism, but practical reality documented through careful medical observation. Consciousness, properly understood and developed, was the ultimate technology for transcending any limitation that existence could present.